Esta pregunta, John, es sobre los paneles 2 y 6 de la exposición en el apartado variaciones. El panel 2 muestra y enfatiza el cambio en la estructura espacial de la casa de un modelo basado en el patio, habitual en el periodo de la colonia española, a uno alrededor del hall como núcleo principal de la casa. Este último se implementa en las casas quinta, un tipo de casa de campo de principios de los años 20. El panel 6 presenta un cambio de paradigma en la distribución de la casa, relacionado con los tipos de agrupación urbana de viviendas y las formas urbanas resultantes. Se pasa de una ciudad con calles definidas por fachadas continuas de edificaciones típicas del casco histórico colonial a calles con una configuración discontinua y una variedad de espacios urbanos intersticiales. Este cambio es producto de una planificación urbana permeada por los debates internacionales sobre la implementación del modelo de ciudad-jardín inglés. John, ¿cuál es tu opinión sobre lo anterior respecto a los paneles 2 y 6 y su representación gráfica? Tienes la palabra, John.
um, I wanted actually to reflect on this in relationship again to the development of the house. What I think is so interesting is that the hall as a building type in a British context has an enormous diversity of forms. It's always recognizable, but the buildings that it's being created within, as your exhibition shows so clearly, are very varied within themselves. It's this odd thing that you can recognize halls, but in fact they do take many different forms and they appear in buildings of every scale and type and context. So in fact what you're showing here, I think, is a similar diversity of application. It's a very interesting, it shows the sort of potential for an interior of this type to be adapted in countless different ways and in countless different contexts. So it underlines the sort of flexibility of this form, which I think is a very interesting and important idea to bear in mind.
Para esta parte de la investigación nos apoyamos en una hipótesis que se fundamenta en considerar la existencia de este modelo o de este patrón arquitectónico específico, contenido tanto en la estructura formal del hall como en los elementos del estilo neotudor, por lo tanto derivado de la tradición doméstica inglesa. Este patrón, por diversas y complejas razones, algunas de las cuales quisimos exponer en otros paneles, como en la sección 3 y la sección 4, tuvo una particular e inusitada acogida en la ciudad de Bogotá durante los años, de los años 30 a los años 50. En este periodo la ciudad vivió un momento histórico especial, una vez que el estándar arquitectónico y de crecimiento urbano de la ciudad colonial vigente desde el siglo XVI, entró en crisis. Y antes de la llegada de las nuevas ideas modernas, que forjadas especialmente en la Europa de entreguerras, irrumpieron con fuerza en el país a partir de los años 50. El cambio en la concepción de la vivienda tuvo un precedente en las llamadas casas quintas, que poco a poco normalizaron la tipología de villa aislada de carácter suburbano. Dicho momento se vio además enriquecido por la influencia tardía del movimiento Arts and Crafts, como la implementación del principio de ciudad-jardín, que vimos o podemos ver en la sección 4. Creemos que estas ideas, que en últimas plantean unos modos de vida particulares, fueron convenientemente difundidas a través de diversos medios ingleses y colombianos, como pueden verse en la sección 11 de la primera parte, y tuvieron un impacto importante a nivel local para el cambio de mentalidad, primero en los responsables de la planificación urbana, pero sobre todo en la sociedad bogotana en general, que las acogió con un cierto entusiasmo.
Ya se ha constatado que a finales del siglo XIX y primera mitad del XX se abandonó el modelo de ciudad vigente desde el XVI, así que ahora propongo algunos juicios analíticos y críticos basados en el material expuesto. Yo creo que los caracteres de la ciudad y de la arquitectura de herencia colonial, para compararlos con el carácter de los crecimientos en ciudad jardín, como las casas quinta eclécticas o los barrios a la inglesa, deberían ilustrarse con la manzana como pieza arquitectónica compuesta y como unidad morfológica de lo urbano, y no con una casa solitaria desvinculada de la manzana, como se hace en la página 128 del catálogo. En este modelo urbano, la unidad jurídica, parcela, se convierte en recinto arquitectónico y luego aparecen en su interior uno o varios patios, así como un zaguán, verandas y una serie de salas con diverso valor. Todos los patios son recintos, pero el que forma la fachada de la manzana no da lugar a un patio, sino que contiene a los demás recintos casa. Así que definir el modelo colonial como arquitectura construida alrededor de un patio resulta simplificador, y decir que el patio es un núcleo abierto, equívoco, pues la característica principal de un patio es ser cerrado pero descubierto. En la misma página 153 se describe la ciudad jardín como porosa, por los intersticios entre edificios. Donde esa porosidad tiene un significado urbano es en el tejido colonial, porque el par zaguán-patio relaciona espacialmente lo privado con lo público. En resumen, la Bogotá del siglo XVI al XX es una verdadera ciudad con toda su complejidad, ya que la residencia privada convive de forma articulada con programas no residenciales, edificios institucionales y con espacios públicos, etc. Mientras que las ciudades jardín son meras extensiones residenciales, aunque como mérito pueden ser consideradas partes de ciudad en el continuo metropolitano.
Throughout the 19th century, the upper-class dwelling in Bogotá kept the colonial model, a one- or two-story house with rooms around the patio. However, in the second half of the century, an economic boom allowed the import of new and better construction tools and materials, making it possible to modernize both the city and its houses. This impetus gave rise to what we call Republican architecture, encouraged by the emerging bourgeoisie, who was keen to follow the modern ways of life of European countries such as England and France. At the turn of the century, some families started building their new homes outside the city, towards the north, on the road to Chapinero. This resulted in the fashionable construction of casa quintas, a type of country house, reflecting in style the global architectural trend towards historicism and eclecticism. Surrounded by its garden, this new house model completely abandoned the colonial plan and its patios, adopting instead a plan based around a large hall. In the plan for Villa Adelaida, the ground floor shows the strategic location of the hall, a large double-height space connecting the social areas and the main staircase. The English neo-Tudor houses that succeeded the Casa Quintas in the 1930s and 40s were also a new type of house with an intermediate hall. But, unlike the quintas, these were urban houses in character, inspired by the English model of the garden city.
I have to say, I have never been to Bogotá. I was tempted to say that when I first contributed at the beginning, but I am completely fascinated by the images that are in the exhibition and that we have just been shown. And the shift that Patricia has just mentioned between a kind of colonial style house and this, frankly, very English arts and crafts vision of a house. I mean, even without seeing the buildings, I can appreciate exactly what you're driving at. It strikes me as absolutely fascinating. And the degree, indeed, to which that plan, which is obviously devised for an English mode of life, is appropriate to the climate of Bogotá. I mean, I find it fascinating how that, whether it's actually quite an uncomfortable shift that you're making. Of course, the shift also marks a movement between, what are effectively two entirely different cultural, it spans two cultural focuses, from a colonial past to a way of English living. I think it's very important to emphasize that in the late 19th century, the British are not just rich, they are the richest kingdom in the world. And the confidence that comes with that is extraordinary. I mean, I think, really from the second decade of the 19th century, after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, until the very early 20th century, there is a kind of confidence and concentration of wealth in England that makes the ideas that it has not only fascinating to the world at large, but something that they wish to emulate. If I may say so, Tim Britton-Catlin's book on Edwardian architecture captures, I think, some of that sense of confidence and the pride in the history of Britain. Britain thinks itself at that period to be a chosen nation, and there is something, I think, unattractive in many ways about that self-confidence and the wealth that it brings with it. But of course, I'm quite sure that that is one of the appeals that makes people want to create this very Anglophile architecture. As I think you will have gathered from my comments before, I would be very keen to emphasize a distinction between the medieval hall in function and the way in which the medieval hall is revived in late Victorian and Edwardian architecture in Britain. Because the halls that the architects of the buildings we've seen in Bogota are looking to and are really buildings in which the hall is a living space. It's the late Victorian house where everything, you've had this moment in the middle of the 19th century where houses have expanded and they have specialist rooms for almost every pastime, from smoking to snooker, from dining to morning calls in the parlor. And these rooms, this really complex planning of mid-Victorian houses. And this, in the late 19th century, is beginning to, these huge structures are beginning to collapse back down to create much more focused and concentrated domestic plans, often with smaller domestic groups of domestic staff, though in this period it's not really important. That's just a kind of a new way of living. It's more convenient, it's more relaxed, there's much less formality to the lifestyle in the houses that are being created. And also in this period, I think it's very important to realize that a sort of intellectual miracle takes place in the late 19th century in Britain, under the influence of figures such as Ruskin and William Morris. And this is an invention of the past as something appealing. Historically in Britain, as in many parts of the world, when houses have become historic, they have become uninteresting. And the story of many manor houses and country houses in England is either a decline into farmhouses or renovation. Every few generations, a new front is put on. The whole building is updated. It's turned around with a new facade to make it seem modern and up to date, with new rooms attached for new social functions. But what Morris and Ruskin and others do is they create an interest in ancient houses, that historic properties have real interest and prestige. And of course, the historic buildings, they think nothing of installing the most up-to-date technology in these buildings. They're very, as I say, the British are the wealthiest people in the world. They want every technology and every convenience. But these historic buildings simply can't sustain these kind of enormous plans with specialist chambers. They are a more informal way of living. And I suppose what you're seeing here is a transposition of this idea that history has character, it has authenticity, it has value, and it's being transposed and associated, value, and it is associated with luxury, which is quite an odd association, I think, in a grander historical context. It's associated with luxury, and it is being transposed into a completely new context. People are looking at this and they're sort of implicitly agreeing and seeking out timber frame and these compact plans, more informal plans for informal living of this period. It's a revolution in lifestyle, and sort of fascinating to see this move to Bogota. What wonderful buildings.